Good evening, everyone. I'm Clare Lopez. I'm Vice President for Research and Analysis at the Center for Security Policy, here tonight with Sharia Crime Stoppers and Make America Think Again. You know, with the wall-to-wall coverage of impeachment, hearings, and nothing but impeachment and hearings 24/7 on all of our media, at least that I can see, whether it's cable TV, network TV, the internet, you name it, I think a great deal of what's going on in the rest of the world is really being ignored. And I think it's important that we might take a look, at least for tonight, at what is going on in the Middle East in particular. That's going to be the subject tonight, because a great big part of the Middle East is up in flames. I mean that literally, up in flames, and nobody, or at least hardly anybody, is covering it. A couple of the think tanks, I give credit to the Foundation for the Defense of Democracy. They do a good job of covering this, for example. There is coverage from the Washington Institute and just a couple of others, but not that much. So let me launch into this. We'll go for, 40 minutes or so, and then we'll be sure to leave time at the end for your questions and answers, which Mary Weirbicki, standing by, will come back on to moderate for us at the end of my presentation. So what I want to talk about is what I've introduced, which is that a great big part of the Middle East right now is up in flames with thousands upon thousands of protesters in the streets. Now, why is this important? I think it's important because the places where this is happening include Iran itself and a number of its satraps. That would be including Iraq and Lebanon. I'm not going to cover anything per se tonight with regard to Syria or Yemen, but as we know, those places are in turmoil as well. But I think it's especially important that I cover Iran, Iraq, Lebanon, and then, of course, the Gaza Strip and Israel. So let me start with Iran. And I think that President Trump's policy of maximum pressure, as they call it, has put the economy of Iran in very dire straits. That is certainly true. And the regime has just been forced within the last few days, at the end of last week, forced to up the price of gasoline in that country by some 400% overnight, 400% increase. And that was affected not by just increasing the price, but effectively by reducing the very hefty government subsidy that formerly had been paid on that gasoline. Now, to put this in perspective, with the 400% increase, gasoline for cars, transportation in Iran now costs about 50 cents a gallon. 50 cents a gallon is the current price now after the 400% increase due to removal of subsidies. But that is a testament, I think, to the poverty being suffered by Iranian people, and also the rationing that has been instituted by the government to 60 liters of gasoline per month. It's not very much. So the poverty of the Iranian people, the dire straits of the Iranian economy are all contributing to this. Well, that happened last Friday. That would be November 15, 2019 here. And the Iranian people just absolutely had it with that, flooded into the streets. And in fact, we have to realize the Iranian people have been in the streets since December 2017. We're coming up on 2 years of protests and demonstrations and labor strikes. They've been sporadic, but they also have been countrywide in the entire country of Iran, which is a difference from what we saw back in the Green Revolution, protests of 2009. And this time, these protests have gotten very violent. They're attacking and burning regime symbols, including banks and stores, and even shutting down Tehran's Grand Bazaar. They're attacking IRGC and Basij posts. IRGC, of course, Islamic Revolutionary Guard. Basij is a subdivision of the IRGC. That's the street militia you see in those black outfits on the black motorcycles, black helmets, and etc. Attacking them, their posts, and the personnel. I mean, actually attacking the officers themselves. They have been barricading highways across the country with burning tires, with just the numbers of people in the streets. Now, the economic situation was the original driver of these protests in Iran, certainly going back to December 2017, and now more currently last Friday on the 15th of November, but very quickly grew to include outrage at the endemic, massive corruption of the Iranian regime, and the actual outrage at the regime itself. There are demands among the protesters now for an end to the Vilayet Faqih system. That is the system of the rule of the jurisprudent. That is the regime's rule instituted by the Ayatollah Khomeini that puts clerics in charge of everything, the entire country, politics and religious affairs. They're calling for the ouster of the regime itself. And this means not just the mullahs, it means the IRGC and its subordinate departments like the Quds Force, the Basij, and also the Intelligence Service, or MOIS, Ministry of Intelligence and Security is the acronym there. The demonstrators are tearing down posters of Khamenei. They're tearing down posters that say death to America. I think that's significant. Students are seizing control of university campuses, especially Tehran University in the capital. There are tens and tens of thousands in the streets. As I said, they're attacking the mullahs themselves, the persons, the actual people, the mullahs. They're attacking, as I said, IRGC, Basij. They're attacking their armored vehicles, their cars, their motorcycles, burning them, and even killing these regime representatives, officials. The protests, as I now see, and by the way, I'm seeing this a lot on social media. However they do it, they're getting videos out, they're getting information out, and that's where I get my information from, Iranian sources inside the country, in particular coming from the Mujahideen cult network, which is powerful and very widespread inside of Iran and others too, though. The protests have now spread to over 100 cities and all 31 provinces of Iran. That includes strikes by truckers, by the bazaris, that's the shopkeepers, teachers, farmers, students, etc. Protests, as I said, across the country, broader and deeper than the 2009 uprisings. And very significant too this time, you see the women's protest, the hijab protest, where they're taking off their scarves, their headscarves in public, which is an arrestable offense. You can land in a VIN prison, other prisons, tortured, jailed, even killed. But they're doing it anyway, and they're doing it on film. Some of the protests, the chants that the protesters are hollering, death to the dictator, Margbar dictator, they're saying Margbar Khomeini, Margbar Rouhani, that's death to Rouhani, death to Khomeini, the supreme leader. They have now, in response, the Iranian regime, as of this weekend past, they have shut down the internet, and they have used deadly force against the protesters. As I've heard today, there are over 200 already killed, and at least 1,000 arrested, many thousands probably injured. I think that the Trump administration has responded. In my opinion, they could be more forceful yet in their measures in response, but in particular, I think that the need of these protesters is communications assistance to get around the jamming, to get around the shutdown of the internet. Iranian young people are pretty tech savvy and resourceful, and they're doing it anyway. But I would like to see our administration openly provide that kind of assistance. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo tweeted, I think that was just yesterday, the United States is with you. I think that's great, but it's going to take more than some tweets. And the other thing to note, unfortunately, is that even with all of this economic pressure that's a result of the Trump administration sanctions pressure, even with all of that, it is the people who are suffering the most, and that is why they're in the streets protesting. Maybe the calculus is that enough economic pressure will cause the Iranian people to rise up in significant enough numbers to lead to a downfall of the regime, but I'm not so sure about that, given that the power, the guns, the force is with the regime. As well, the Iranian regime continues with all of its WMD programs. That means nuclear, chemical, and biological. Yes, they have all of that. Their ballistic missile programs, their support to Hamas and Hezbollah, the Hashd Shabi Shiite militias in Iraq, the Houthis, perhaps at a diminished level of support, but nevertheless continuing, and then as well the incrementally expanding violation of the terms of the JCPOA, Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. That's the nuclear deal from back in July 2015. But that's just openly. I mean, they've been violating that and other agreements like the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty basically since 1988. But that's openly now. And so the priorities for the administration are clear. Let the people suffer while regime priorities continue. Now, let me just give you a little bit of data, numbers, figures about the Iranian economy and what's happening to it. The World Bank, for example, estimates that Iranian GDP decline will amount to 4.5% for this year, 2019, at the end of it all. And that's not just because of U.S. sanctions, although that's a large part of it. But there's a lot of institutional weakness and massive corruption within the Iranian system already, even before sanctions have taken their toll. Also to mention, I think, is the demographic situation within Iran. It has a rapidly aging society. The birth rate in Iran, I don't know if you all know this, but the birth rate in Iran over the last decade and more has literally gone off a cliff. They went from something like 6 or 7 children per woman per lifetime to fewer than 2, meaning 1 point something or other, 1.7 or 1.8 perhaps, something like that. According to the World Bank data, again, in 2018, the senior population of Iran amounted to 9% of the population at last year's number, about 84 million people total. About 9% were seniors, senior citizens. But by 2050, the World Bank estimates that seniors will amount to 30 million of a population at that time, 2050, of 100 million. Do that math. That is something like close to a third of the population of Iran by 2050 will be senior citizens. Absolutely unsustainable. They can't do it. Unemployment right now is about 14% and rising sharply. Among the young people, it is 27%. Those are last year's figures, actually 2018. Still, though, the bottom line is this, I think, for Iran, and then we'll move on to the other places. The Iranian regime cannot, we can see this now, they physically cannot or financially cannot fund both their domestic needs and the revolution abroad on the current budget, which is not getting any better. So The race is on. In my opinion, that race is between whether regime change will happen first or the regime will achieve deliverable nuclear weapons first. And then secondly, part of this race, will there be a breakdown, a collapse of the Shiite crescent, as it's sometimes called? Well, let's move to Iraq now and take a look at what's happening there. This isn't being covered in the news either. So at the beginning of October, that is about a month and a half ago, at the beginning of the month of October 2019, widespread leaderless, that's important, leaderless, popular, and violent protests broke out in Iraq, centered on Baghdad, but also south to Baghdad, from Baghdad to Basra, and encompassing the Shiite population of southern Iraq. There too, the protests began as economic protests, but they spread very quickly again to demands for the resignation of Prime Minister Adel Abdul al-Mahdi and his entire government and new elections. The protesters have now blocked a very key port. It's called Qasr. They've blocked that port. It is located south of Basra in the southern part of Iraq. They have blocked bridges and streets in Baghdad, Basra, and other places of the south. Katyusha rockets are being fired in Baghdad, close to the Green Zone, which, as you may know, is the seat of government for Iraq in Baghdad, and it's also the place where all the foreign representations, including our own U.S. monstrosity of a massive embassy, is located. The protesters in Baghdad currently now, as of today, that's the 18th of November, hold 3 bridges in Baghdad. They hold them, they control them, they block them. These bridges span the Tigris River in Baghdad, seriously cutting down on the ability of traffic to flow or regularly, ordinarily. The protests have been fueled by the Shiite cleric and terror militia leader whose name may sound familiar to you, Muqtada al-Sadr. He gained, I don't know, infamy, I think I'd say notoriety, in the middle 2000s in the very vicious fighting against the U.S. coalition partners in Iraq. Anyway, Muqtada al-Sadr today leads the largest bloc in the Iraqi parliament. But after he was on board with calling for the downfall of the Baghdad government, the resignation of Prime Minister al-Mahdi, apparently got called to Tehran. And he went there for an entire week at the beginning of November, just a couple weeks ago, and he came back a changed man. Now his new approach says to blame the US and blame Israel for everything that's going on inside of Iraq, but keep al-Mahdi in power. That signals that the policy, the wish, the desire of the Tehran regime is to keep the current corrupt government of al-Mahdi and his political allies in power in Baghdad. Now, the other part of the Iraqi protests is that there is outright open anger expressed openly against the Iranian regime involvement in their country, in Iran. Now remember, I said that the majority of these protests are happening Baghdad and south, the Shiite heartland of Iraq, or well, what's left of Iraq. There really isn't a country anymore. But that is the Shiite heartland of this regime. And it is there that the protests are against the involvement of the Iranian regime in Iraqi government. They are attacking Iranian bases, weapons depots. Yes, they have those all over Iraq. The response of the Baghdad regime, well, it's been a violent crackdown. Hundreds have been killed. As of today, the figures I saw are upwards of 320 killed already in the Iraqi protests. Thousands have been injured. And this follows a visit to Baghdad by Iranian Quds Force Commander Major General Qasem Soleimani. He blew into Baghdad in early October, more than a month ago, and invited himself into a meeting of the top levels of the Iraqi government, and that was being chaired at the time by the Prime Minister al-Mahdi. Invited himself in, entered into the room, sat down and took control of the meeting. This was of the top security officials in Iraq, and basically read them the Riot Act and ordered a violent crackdown against the protesters, which is what has ensued ever since. You can see who is in charge in Baghdad. They are now using live ammunition and a sort of Iranian-made tear gas grenade that actually pierces people's skulls and inflicts other lethal injuries on them, not just ordinary tear gas canisters, but special ones imported from Iran. The people know this, by the way. And so the heavy-handed response of the Baghdad regime has only fueled the protesters. It has not deterred them so far. And those protests have only grown, not diminished, over time since the last month and more. There is a publication here online in the US called The Intercept. You may have seen it. And The Intercept, interestingly, recently obtained, and they won't say from where, maybe they don't know exactly, but they have obtained hundreds of leaked Iranian regime documents, dated mostly from 2014 and 2015, from the Iranian intelligence service, the MOIS. And if you go online at The Intercept, you'll see the articles about this. The New York Times has also published about these leaked documents. But what struck me, and I'll leave Iraq with this, what struck me about the pieces written at The Intercept and the New York Times about these leaked documents from Iran, from its intelligence service, are the incredible levels of naivete. They're aghast, they're appalled, they're shocked that the Iranian regime, you ready for it? Sitting down? They've been collaborating with the Muslim Brotherhood. Can you imagine? Sunnis and Shiites, they're actually working together. Well, that level of naivete is nigh onto criminal. Of course, as we all know, the Iranian regime and al-Qaeda, which is made up of senior leadership who began their quote-unquote careers with the Muslim Brotherhood, such as Abdullah Azzam, no longer with us, Osama bin Laden, no longer with us, and current al-Qaeda chief Ayman al-Zawahiri, all started off as members of the Muslim Brotherhood. So, I mean, hello. But it's good to see these documents out there. It's good to see these revelations posted, printed in The Intercept and New York Times. I'll make sure, if you would like, that Sharia Crime Stoppers puts out the links for those documents, those published pieces. All right, let's go to Lebanon, because this is incredibly important as well. Beginning in the middle of October, it's really just about exactly 1 month ago, popular, I would even call it nationalist, Lebanese nationalists. You don't see that. We have not seen that. A revolt began against the government of Lebanon, which is synonymous essentially with Hezbollah, which owns Lebanon, which controls the government on behalf of the Islamic Republic of Iran, of course. And the chants in the streets of Lebanon, Beirut even, are that the people want to bring down the regime. This is very evocative of what I've just been telling you about what's going on in Iran and Iraq. And no, I'm not suggesting that these three revolts are necessarily linked, but there is something going on. I don't mean to say that they're centrally organized or anything like that, but the simultaneous nature of them and the similarity of the protesters' demands, I think, are striking. So let's keep that in the back of our minds as we talk about this. not sure at all yet where these protests in Lebanon will be going to. In late October, the Lebanese government collapsed at the very, very end of October, that is, and the Prime Minister Saad Hariri resigned. Hariri, has said that he will not return, even if he's asked to return to his post as Prime Minister. He will not return unless he is allowed to form a technocrat government. That is, a government of actual technical experts in the economy, let's say, in commerce, in trade, etc., that can garner international support, because what is needed is that international support and investment. To this date, though, Lebanon is still struggling to form a new government and has not gotten there at all. The broad-based anger of the Lebanese is specifically aimed at the corruption, the mismanagement, and the sectarian political nature of the Lebanese regime that doles out jobs and economic goodies, if you will, to its own supporters. Now, you might know that Lebanon has a unique system of government by which the president of the country must be a Christian. The prime minister, as Saad Hariri, must be a Sunni Muslim, and the speaker of the parliament must be a Shiite Muslim. And that is the sectarian division of power that has kept Lebanon out of war, out of outright war, since the end of its horrific civil war that ran, as you know, 1975 until 1990, when the Syrians stepped in and occupied the country. So the thing, though, that the protesters are furious about is that this sectarian confessional type of system perpetuates sectarian divides in the country and serves to hand out, as we say, the economic benefits each sectarian group, each Sunni, Shiite, Christian, to its own people, its own followers, its own supporters. I mean, it's pure nepotism, is what it is, and they're up to here with it. That is why they're in the streets now. In Lebanon, the banks have closed, at least sporadically closed. The withdrawal of U.S. dollars from people's accounts has been controlled very tightly. The Lebanese pound, that is their currency, is sliding disastrously. The system is on the verge of collapse in Lebanon. Now, this has to do with many things, but terrible administration, bloated bureaucracy, economic mismanagement, and then the result, rampant poverty of the people. Now, the West's response recently, and of course, especially under President Trump and our Treasury Department, the reluctance not just to invest with anything connected to Hezbollah and its criminality, and while that's in charge, but the levying of sanctions against Hezbollah and banks and other institutions associated with it have had a great deal to do with this. Hezbollah, Iran were laundering money through the banks, and that is not sustainable anymore with the economic pressures being placed on Lebanon as well. Now, importantly, I want to point out to you that even poor Shiites from the Dahiya, that is the southern Beirut neighborhood, that's the stronghold of Hezbollah in the entire country, and in Beirut, of course, even the Shiites, young people from the Dahiya neighborhood, are joining in the protests. They are directly challenging Hezbollah's image as the champion of the people, because they haven't championed them, because they haven't stood up for them, because Hezbollah has been as involved in the corruption, the nepotism, and the mismanagement as any other sect. Hundreds of thousands of Lebanese are on the streets. the important thing that I mentioned earlier, this is not a confessionally based or sectarian based uprising this time. Sunnis, Shiites, Christians, by the way, Christians probably maximum in Lebanon today number maybe 30%, with the remainder divvied up among Sunnis, Shiites, and Druze. But all of them are together in these protests now. That is significant. It's different. We need to pay attention to that. Now, the president of Lebanon, as I told you about that division of power, Michel Aoun, is a Christian. He heads a militia from dating back from the Civil War period, the militia called the Free Patriotic Movement. He heads the entire Maronite Catholic community in Lebanon, and staunchly allied, I mean, to the point of an MOU, a Memorandum of Understanding, completely and with the entire Christian population of Lebanon in cahoots, in collaboration with Hezbollah. The Lebanese army, likewise, as an institution, is dominated by Hezbollah, which far out, what would you say, it has better weapons, it has better training, it has better ability to field fighters even than the Lebanese army itself. All in all, that means Lebanon is not an independent country and has not been for a long time. Lebanon is another satrap of Iran, but deep trouble going on. Just a couple quick more notes there, and we'll go to Israel and Gaza and then wrap up. Russia's foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, asserted very strong support for the Beirut regime, which he knows perfectly well is dominated by Hezbollah, because Russia fears that destabilization in Lebanon could lead to destabilization in next door Syria, well, what's left of it. That's not a country anymore anyway, either, but never mind. Russia fears destabilization of the gains it has made during the civil war in Syria that has been going on since 2011. Iran, for its part, has pledged, of course, to defend the Hezbollah regime in Lebanon against what they're calling the axis of resistance. Even the Hezbollah Secretary General, that is Hassan Nasrallah, has been forced to issue a call for dialogue, but he has his militiamen, the Hezbollah militiamen, on alert nationwide nevertheless, to prevent the total collapse of Lebanon's sectarian system, under which, I mean, Hezbollah operates and benefits. So the assessment, my assessment, is that Hezbollah and Iran will fight savagely. They will murder as many Lebanese people as they need to preserve their grip on power in Lebanon. Okay, let's go to Israel and Gaza, because that too has been a front not well covered, in my opinion, in much of the news, which is, again, 24/7 impeachment. So Israel and Gaza are, I think, important to mention, because on 11th of November, that is just about a week ago, the Israeli armed forces conducted the targeted assassination of the terror commander of the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, or PIJ, sometimes call it for short, Baha Abu al-Atta. And this was by way of an airstrike in Gaza. And that strike, that assassination, targeted assassination, unleashed waves of rocket and missile fire coming out of Gaza into Israel in the days immediately following that assassination. In particular, places close to Gaza were targeted, Beersheba, Sderot, and other places further away as well. The Iron Dome system, you know, Israel's missile defense system, performed admirably once again. No Israelis were killed by that incoming rocket fire, although I think there were some injuries. Abu al-Atta, called by the Israeli government a ticking time bomb. He had long been involved in commanding terror strikes against Israel. He's got Israeli blood on his hands dating back many, many years. And at this point, the Israelis decided it was time that he went to meet his virgins because he was actively involved in planning an imminent and deadly strike against Israel. Since that time of the assassination a week ago, there has been a ceasefire more or less holding at the moment, although it appears that over the weekend, Hamas leadership has not joined in this retaliatory wave of rocket strikes launched by Pidge, but it appears that some of Hamas forces within Hamas controlled areas of Gaza did fire 2 rockets 2 days ago. That would be, I guess, Saturday over this past weekend. And the IDF did respond immediately with counterstrikes against Hezbollah. Okay, let me wrap up here. I'm looking at the clock on my wall, and be sure to allow some time for your questions and answers. So in no particular order here, I think many of us may wish that the United States were involved in coordinated efforts to degrade the Iranian regime influence in this region of the Middle East, the Shiite Crescent area. But to the best of my knowledge and observation, I don't see that U.S. involvement. Maybe, maybe it's going on covertly, and if so, bravo. But it's not evident, despite, of course, the hysterical claims coming out of Tehran. But that's normal. The uprisings, to me, at this point, in Iran, in Iraq, in Lebanon, appear to be what you might say homemade, homegrown, indigenous, just people fed up. And there were precipitating factors, like we've mentioned, the terrific rise in price of gasoline, for example, inside of Iran. I think that President Trump and senior officials of our government ought to be vocally declaring their support for the protesters in each of these places. And I would like to see, well, or maybe not see, but I would like it to be happening, covert provision of assistance, especially with communications technology, to help the protesters to coordinate and organize their activities. And we should also be denying any more support, U.S. government assistance of any kind, to corrupt Iranian satraps. And I mean Baghdad, and I mean Beirut. I think that U.S. leadership should continue to speak out on behalf of human rights, democratic reform, including the disarming of militias like Hezbollah that do not respect internationally agreed upon rule of law. I will give credit for some of that point there to Federation for Defense of Democracies. They put out a piece recently, just today, along those lines, and I wholeheartedly agree. I think that there is an incredible turning point happening in front of our eyes right now across the Middle East. And one of the things that I have to applaud President Trump and his administration for at this time of tectonic plates moving, I might say, is the announcement just today by President Trump, his statement that Israeli settlements in Judea and Samaria do not violate international law. That is huge. That is so important, long overdue, and absolutely correct as regards international law. I would not like to see any further recognition of the regime in Lebanon, for example, as representative of the people, or that regime in Beirut as a legitimate regime, or that Lebanon is an independent country. It's just not. And I think that we should not be channeling any more military assistance or any other kind to the Lebanese National Army, which I think is a sub, I don't know, directorate, department of Hezbollah, of the Iranian regime, in fact. And no more money, American taxpayer money, I think no more should go into propping up what is a thoroughly corrupt system in Lebanon. More things that are positive. I want to balance this out. The U.S. Treasury sanctions against Hezbollah banks and named leadership of Hezbollah are important and useful and effective. But in the end, I don't think that that system in Lebanon, or for that matter, Iran or Iraq, can be salvaged without actual physical military defeat of Hezbollah, of Iranian forces and Shiite terror proxies like the Hashd-e-Shaabi in Iraq. Finally, let's just stay tuned to these uprisings. You can find a lot of this if you're on Twitter. Other social media carry the videos that are brought out from inside these places that might be otherwise blocked. Somehow they get them out. So be sure to be on Twitter, be on Instagram, be on Telegram. That's where they're coming out. That's where I'm seeing them. And stay tuned. These three uprisings in Iraq, in Iran, and in Lebanon, all three Iranian satraps, well, Iran itself and the other two, I think they pose a very serious challenge to the Tehran regime. And those brave people on the streets of those countries all deserve our support, whatever we can provide in social media or otherwise, so that they may succeed eventually in achieving their own liberty and taking control of their own governance and their own future. So with that, I will say thank you very much and welcome Mary back on to take your questions and hopefully give you some answers. Thank you.
That was incredibly comprehensive, Claire. Thank you for doing that. I have a couple questions for you. You talked about, I think, or maybe I missed it, that the in Lebanon it was non-sectarian. Is that true across all of them? Or is that just Lebanon?
Not quite. I mentioned that with regard to Lebanon because it's so unusual, because Lebanon has been divided sectarially or by confession, Sunni, Shiite, Christian, Druze, for many, many decades. And the fact that now those divisions seem to be superseded by an almost nationalist Lebanese identity and outrage, I think is notable. That's not the same thing to say in Iraq, where the brunt or the majority of the protests are coming from the Shiite population, as I said, Baghdad and south, and then of course inside of Iran itself, those protests are all over the entire country, which people may know is perhaps only around 50% Persian ethnically, with the periphery geographically of Iran occupied by many different ethnic minorities, from the Baluchis to the Azeris to the Kurds to the Ahwaz Arabs and more. But all of those areas in Iran now are up in arms and protesting.
Mm. All right, we've got some questions for you from our attendees, and one of them is asking, is there anything that the U.S. could do in support of the people there in terms of restrictions, tariffs, sanctions? Does that help the people, or is that really more harmful for the general protesters?
You know, I mean, in the first instance, things like that are going to hurt the people as the economy, you know, the economies are now suffering. If your policy purpose is intended to cause enough domestic pain that the people rise up in sufficient numbers and persistence to overthrow the regime, I think that's a little bit callous. I think that's a little bit insensitive to the people, because we don't know if it'll be effective, number one.
Right.
And number two, how long it might even take, even if it were to be effective. I think, I mean, my personal opinion is that a lot more assistance of other kinds needs to be channeled to these people right now, beginning with communications assistance, but other assistance too.
Thank you. We've got somebody asking about whether or not some of these revolutions, you talked about them being leaderless revolutions, could possibly be related to the deep state, and an activist called Alec J. Ross, who specializes in leaderless revolutions created in an effort to get socialist communist regimes under the Open Society and Civil Society 2.0, something that Glenn Beck has been talking about.
Yeah, no, understand what you're talking about there with the question. But in these parts of the Middle East, that is not a factor. George Soros is not a factor, to the best of my knowledge. Open Society, communist Marxism. At the moment right now, these protests are homegrown, indigenous, to the best of all, visually to me, and they have to do with very localized issues having to do, as I said, with the economies, with the corruption, with the mismanagement, and so forth.
Well, Roger is asking about what you finished up with in terms of the president's announcement that the Judea and Samaria settlements are okay to have, and he's wondering whether or not this instills more riots, more attacks from Gaza, and where that might go.
Probably not from Gaza. Gaza has its own separate government, as we know, under Hamas, under Ismail Haniyeh, and military commanders like Yahya Sinwar, separate and hostile to the Palestinian Authority operating out of Ramallah under Abu Mazen. They are separate and hostile to each other. So, if anything, the outrage and the opposition to the statement by President Trump, and of course to the Israeli government, is going to come out of Ramallah, Palestinian Authority, Palestinian Liberation Organization, Fatah, and so forth, but probably not out of Gaza.
Okay. Can you provide some insight regarding your impressions of how President Trump might be handling all of these issues?
Well, as I said, the last question right there from Roger about Judea and Samaria and settlements there being absolutely not counter to international law, hugely important, as well as President Trump's earlier decision, of course, to move the U.S. Embassy to Israel's eternal and undivided capital of Jerusalem, hugely important. Also, President Trump's declaration earlier again, that is earlier this year, 2019, that Israeli control, sovereignty over the Golan Heights is recognized by the United States. And those are tremendously important policies by the president. And that is just as regarding, Israel and its neighbors. But on the other places, well, a lot of different policies. Pulling out of the JCPOA was hugely important as regards Iran, the reimposition and upping of sanctions against the Iranian regime and against Hezbollah, hugely important. I just think that sanctions alone, while perhaps setting the battlefield, preparing intelligence preparation of the environment, the military calls this, is the first step. I think more steps are going to be needed to bring down these regimes, because the Iranian regime and its militias and its allied terror proxies are completely willing to massacre as many people as it takes for them to keep in power in these places, and that's not going to be solved by sanctions alone.
Now, you talked a little bit about the covert operations that could possibly be going on to help them, at least through the internet and whatever else that we can possibly help them with. I think that's probably, hopefully, what they're doing.
Well, I mean, covert means, covert for a reason, that it's not obvious, that we don't see it. And so that's merely my wish that were taking place, but I don't know that it is.
We've got Karen is asking your thoughts on whether or not there's a huge number of Iranian Muslims turning to Christianity. Any thoughts on that?
I've heard reports about that, but it's very difficult to get real verification, corroboration of numbers or anything like that. So I just don't know, but I will say that, yes, I've heard reports like that
Yeah, I have
too.
too. Yeah.
I do know that among Iranian immigrants here to the United States, a number, and some known personally to me, have left Islam, but not for Christianity, simply to turn to atheism. They're fed up. They've had it with religion, period.
Yeah. All right, that's all the questions for tonight. Excellent presentation. Thank you so much, Claire. And I'll just announce a couple of things and I'll let you close it out with your final thoughts. We have our regular Tuesday night, tomorrow night, with David Boris, who's going to be speaking on Muslimas. And then we have Thursday night with Dr. Mark Christian, who's going to be joining us for the first time. And in January, returning doing the third Thursday of every month. So this is a new program that we're presenting to everybody as well. And I'll let you talk about how you're going to be returning in January and close us out. Thank you so much, Claire.
All right. Thank you, Mary. And of course, thank you, Dick, there behind the scenes. Yes, we're going to take a holiday break, but I will be returning to Sharia Crime Stoppers on Monday, January 13, and thereafter bi-monthly or every other week, probably continuing with the Monday presentations on a webinar format here with Zoom. And I hope you'll join me then. And so I thank you again for being with us tonight and look forward to rejoining you in January. Thank you very much.